What happens when one of the biggest superstars in entertainment sits down for what should be a routine morning show interview, only to face a host who seems determined to tear her down? What we witnessed on CBS Sunday Morning was nothing short of explosive, as Jennifer Lopez found herself in the fight of her life against Tony Dokoupil, a journalist who apparently forgot the basic rules of respect and professionalism. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in how not to treat your guests. And by the end of it, security had to step in. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about hosts who ambush their guests. The morning started like any other at the CBS studios in New York. Jennifer Lopez arrived at 6:30 in the morning, perfectly dressed in an elegant cream-colored blazer, her hair styled flawlessly despite the early hour. She had been booked on CBS Sunday Morning to promote her latest project. And like the consummate professional she is, she came prepared with talking points, anecdotes, and that signature Lopez charm that has captivated audiences for decades. Tony Dokoupil, however, seemed to have other plans entirely. From the moment the cameras started rolling, something felt off. Where most hosts would begin with warm pleasantries, or perhaps a comment about her stunning appearance, Tony launched straight into what could only be described as an interrogation. "Jennifer, let's talk about your recent projects," Tony began, but his tone was already sharp, cutting. "Some critics are saying, you're past your prime. How do you respond to that?" The question hit the studio like a slap. Even the crew members exchanged glances, their expressions showing clear discomfort. This wasn't how you open an interview with a guest, especially not someone of Jennifer's caliber. Jennifer, to her credit, maintained her composure. She shifted slightly in her chair, a practiced smile still gracing her lips, though anyone watching closely could see the flash of surprise in her eyes. "Well, Tony, I think that's an interesting way to start our conversation," she replied, her voice steady, but with a hint of steel underneath. "I've been blessed to have a career that spans over 3 decades, and I'm still here because I continue to evolve and challenge myself. I think my work speaks for itself." But Tony wasn't done. In fact, he seemed emboldened by her diplomatic response. "But let's be honest here, Jennifer. Your last few movies haven't performed well at the box office. Your music isn't topping the charts like it used to. Are you having trouble accepting that your best days might be behind you?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. This wasn't journalism. This was character assassination disguised as an interview. The camera operators looked uncomfortable behind their equipment, and you could practically feel the tension radiating from every corner of the room. Jennifer's smile finally began to falter. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a warning that Tony should have heeded. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some confusion about what kind of interview this was supposed to be," she said, her Puerto Rican accent becoming slightly more pronounced as her emotions began to surface. "I came here to talk about my current projects and connect with your audience. I didn't come here to be disrespected." Tony leaned back in his chair with what could only be described as a smirk. "I'm just asking the questions that people want answers to, Jennifer. Isn't that what good journalism is about?" "Good journalism," Jennifer shot back, her voice rising slightly, "involves preparation, respect, and actually listening to your guests' answers instead of just waiting for your next opportunity to attack." The word attack hung in the air like smoke from a gun. This was no longer a celebrity interview. This had become a battle of wills. And Tony Dokoupil seemed to be enjoying every second of it. "Attack," Tony repeated, finding innocence. "I think you're being a bit dramatic, don't you?" "I'm simply doing my job." "Your job," Jennifer said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her years in the industry, "is supposed to be creating an engaging conversation that serves your viewers. What you're doing is trying to create controversy for clicks and views, and you're doing it at my expense." The crew was now openly staring. In all their years of working television, they had rarely seen a guest stand up to a host so directly, and they had certainly never seen a host be so blatantly disrespectful to someone of Jennifer's stature. Tony, however, seemed to interpret her resistance as weakness rather than strength. He pressed forward with even more aggression. "Well, since we're talking about controversy, let's discuss your personal life. Your relationships have been pretty public, haven't they? Some might say you have a pattern of failed relationships. What do you think that says about you as a person?" The question crossed every line of decency and professionalism. Jennifer Bunk's eyes flashed with genuine anger now, and she leaned forward in her chair. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "What did you just say to me?" Tony, apparently mistaking her controlled fury for surrender, doubled down. I'm talking about your track record with relationships, multiple marriages, public breakups. Don't you think your fans deserve to know if there's something about your character that makes it difficult for you to maintain long-term commitments? The studio fell into complete silence, except for the hum of the cameras. Even the sound technicians seemed to be holding their breath. Jennifer Lopez, one of the most successful entertainers in the world, sat frozen for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of what she had just heard. When she finally spoke, her voice carried decades of experience dealing with media scrutiny, public judgment, and the kind of sexist double standards that female celebrities face every day. "Tony, I want you to listen to me very carefully," she began, her tone now completely stripped of any pretense of media-trained politeness. "I have been in this business for over 30 years. I have dealt with every kind of journalist, interviewer, and media personality you can imagine. I have answered tough questions. I have discussed personal topics when appropriate, and I have always maintained my professionalism even when others have not." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But what you just asked me, that wasn't journalism. That was a personal attack designed to humiliate me on national television. And I want to know right now, before we go any further, what your goal is here. Because if your goal is to have a respectful conversation about my career and my projects, then we can continue. But if your goal is to tear me down for your own entertainment, then we have a problem." Tony's response would prove to be the match that lit the fuse on what was about to become television history. Instead of acknowledging the valid points Jennifer had just made, instead of recognizing that he had crossed a line, Tony Dokoupil did something that shocked everyone in that studio. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an apologetic chuckle, but a condescending, dismissive laugh that seemed to say he found her concerns amusing rather than legitimate. Jennifer, he said, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher addressing a difficult student. "I think you're taking this way too personally. This is television. This is what we do here. We ask the hard questions that other people are afraid to ask." The audacity of his response sent a visible shock through Jennifer's system. Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she seemed genuinely stunned that another human being could be so completely tone-deaf to what had just happened. "Are you seriously sitting there telling me that I'm taking personal attacks too personally?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "Tony, do you hear yourself right now? Do you understand what you just said to me?" But Tony was on a roll now, apparently believing that he was in control of the situation. He leaned forward, adopting what he probably thought was a serious journalistic pose. "What I said was a legitimate question about patterns of behavior that are part of your public record. If you can't handle questions about your public life, then maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The words hit the studio like a bomb. Several crew members actually gasped audibly. The camera operator closest to Jennifer later said that he could see her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from pure rage. Jennifer stood up. The movement was so sudden and decisive that it caught everyone off guard. She didn't slam her chair back or make any dramatic gestures. She simply rose to her feet with the kind of dignity and presence that reminded everyone in that room exactly who they were dealing with. "I need you to stop the cameras right now," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. Tony, however, seemed to interpret her standing as some kind of tantrum. "Oh, come on, Jennifer. Sit back down. You're being ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" Jennifer repeated. And now her voice carried the full power of someone who had spent decades commanding stages, movie sets, and boardrooms. "I'm being ridiculous for expecting basic human decency from a professional interviewer." She turned to address the crew directly, ignoring Tony completely. "I want the cameras off. This interview is over." "Now, wait just a minute," Tony interjected, finally seeming to realize that he might be losing control of the situation. "You can't just walk out of an interview because you don't like the questions." Jennifer turned back to face him, and the look in her eyes could have frozen water. "Watch me," she said simply. But Tony, in what would prove to be his final and most catastrophic mistake, decided to try to assert his authority as the host. "Jennifer, you signed a contract to be here. You have professional obligations. You can't just storm off because someone asked you a tough question." "A tough question?" Jennifer's voice rose for the first time, and the raw emotion in it was unmistakable. "Tony, you attack my character. You insulted my personal relationships, and you did it all with a smile on your face like you were enjoying every second of it. That's not tough journalism. That's cruelty. She began moving toward her purse, which was sitting on a nearby chair, clearly preparing to leave. Tony, apparently panicking at the thought of losing his interview, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Fine, if that's how you want to play this," he said, his voice taking on a nasty edge that everyone in the room could hear. "Maybe this is exactly the kind of behavior that explains why your relationships don't work out. Maybe this is why people are starting to say you're difficult to work with." The studio went dead silent. Jennifer stopped moving. She turned around slowly, and when she looked at Tony this time, there was something different in her expression. The anger was still there, but now it was joined by something else. Something that made even the seasoned television crew take a step back. "What did you just say to me?" she asked, her voice so quiet it was barely above a whisper. Tony, apparently realizing he had gone too far but unable to back down now, stumbled forward with his attack. "I'm just saying that maybe if you could handle a little criticism, a little tough questioning, then maybe you wouldn't have such a hard time maintaining professional relationships." "Professional relationships?" Jennifer repeated slowly, as if she was testing each word. "Tony, are you suggesting that my response to your unprofessional behavior is somehow indicative of problems in my personal life?" "I'm suggesting," Tony said, his voice getting more defensive by the second, "that maybe you need to learn how to take feedback without getting so emotional about it." The word emotional was the final straw. Jennifer Lopez had spent her entire career being told she was too emotional whenever she stood up for herself. She had heard it from directors who wanted to pay her less than her male co-stars, from music executives who wanted to control her image, from journalists who wanted to reduce her to gossip instead of discussing her actual achievements. And now here was Tony Dokoupil using that same tired sexist playbook. "Emotional," she repeated. And now her voice carried 30 years of frustration with men who had tried to diminish her by dismissing her legitimate concerns as hysteria. "Tony, I want you to think very carefully about your next words, because what you say right now is going to determine whether this situation gets worse, or whether we can find some way to salvage what's left of your professionalism." But Tony, apparently incapable of reading the room or recognizing the gravity of the moment, chose to dig his hole even deeper. "Look, Jennifer, I get that you're used to people treating you like a princess, but this is real journalism. If you can't handle it, then maybe you should stick to entertainment shows where they'll just ask you about your favorite color and what you had for breakfast." The condescension in his voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He had just dismissed her intelligence, her professionalism, and her right to be treated with basic respect, all in one sentence. Jennifer looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was calm, measured, and absolutely devastating. "Tony, I have been interviewed by Barbara Walters, Oprah Winfrey, Anderson Cooper, and every major journalist in this country. I have sat down with hard-hitting reporters who asked me challenging questions about my career, my choices, and yes, even my personal life. And you know what the difference was between them and you?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air. "They treated me like a human being. They asked their tough questions with respect and professionalism. They didn't try to humiliate me for their own entertainment. They understood that there's a difference between holding someone accountable and trying to tear them down." Tony opened his mouth to respond, but Jennifer held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," she said, and the authority in her voice was absolute. "You want to talk about professionalism? Let's talk about professionalism. A professional journalist prepares for their interviews. They research their subjects. They ask questions that serve their audience, not their own ego. A professional journalist treats their guests with respect, even when asking difficult questions." She took a step closer to Tony, and her voice dropped to that dangerous whisper again. "What you did here today wasn't journalism, Tony. It was a power trip. And the most pathetic part is that you seem to think you won something here. You seem to think that making me uncomfortable, that attacking my character, that trying to humiliate me on national television somehow makes you a better interviewer." The weight of her words seemed to finally penetrate Tony's consciousness. And for the first time since the interview began, he looked uncertain. The weight of her words seemed to finally penetrate Tony's consciousness. And for the first time since the interview began, he looked uncertain. But instead of taking this moment to apologize, instead of recognizing that he had an opportunity to salvage what was left of his reputation, Tony Dokoupil made one final catastrophic decision. He tried to turn the tables on her. "You know what, Jennifer," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge that everyone in the room could hear. "Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is that you've been surrounded by yes men for so long that you can't handle it when someone asks you real questions." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Tony had just suggested that Jennifer Lopez, a woman who had built an empire through sheer determination and talent, was somehow delusional about her own abilities because people around her were too intimidated to tell her the truth. Jennifer stared at him for a moment, and something shifted in her expression. The anger was still there, but now it was joined by something that might have been pity. "Tony," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of someone who had seen this behavior pattern many times before. "Do you honestly believe that someone gets to where I am in this industry by being surrounded by people who lie to them? Do you think I've maintained a career for 3 decades by being delusional about my own abilities?" She gestured around the studio, taking in the crew members who were watching this exchange with horrified fascination. "Look around this room, Tony. Look at the faces of your own crew. Do you see anyone who thinks what you're doing right now is professional journalism? Do you see anyone who thinks your behavior today has been appropriate?" Indeed, the crew members looked deeply uncomfortable. Several had started whispering among themselves, and at least one had pulled out their phone, presumably to alert someone in management about what was happening. But Tony, apparently unable to accept that he might be wrong, decided to make his final stand. "I don't need approval from my crew to do my job, Jennifer. And I don't need approval from you either. This is my show, and I'll conduct interviews however I see fit." "Your show," Jennifer repeated. And now there was something almost dangerous in her calm tone. "Tony, let me explain something to you about how television actually works. This might be your show, but I'm your guest, and guests have the right to be treated with basic human decency." She picked up her purse and slung it over her shoulder with deliberate precision. "More importantly, this show exists because people watch it. And people watch it because they want to see interesting conversations with compelling guests. What you've done here today isn't interesting. It's not compelling. And it's certainly not the kind of content that builds audience loyalty." Tony was starting to look genuinely panicked now. The interview that was supposed to be a routine promotional segment had turned into a public relations nightmare, and he was beginning to realize that he might have seriously miscalculated. "Jennifer, please, let's just sit back down and finish the interview properly," he said, his tone finally shifting towards something that resembled contrition. "Properly?" Jennifer's eyebrows rose. "Tony, do you understand that everything you've said to me today has been recorded? Do you understand that your behavior here is going to be seen by executives, by other potential guests, by your own colleagues?" She took a step toward the studio exit, then turned back to face him one more time. "But most importantly, do you understand that your treatment of me today says absolutely nothing about me and everything about you?" Tony, desperate now, tried to block her path to the door. "You can't just leave, Jennifer. We have a contract. There are legal obligations here." "Legal obligations," Jennifer said, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had dealt with contracts and legal matters for decades. "Tony, I fulfilled my legal obligation when I showed up here prepared to do a professional interview. You violated your professional obligation when you decided to turn this into a personal attack session." She looked directly into his eyes, and her next words were delivered with the kind of precision that comes from years of dealing with people who underestimate her intelligence. "And if you or anyone else wants to discuss legal obligations, I suggest you have your lawyers review exactly what constitutes a hostile work environment, because what you created here today might very well qualify." The threat was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly that it took Tony a moment to process what she had just said. When he did, the color drained from his face. "Now you're threatening me," he said, his voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "I'm not threatening you, Tony. I'm educating you. There's a difference, though. I understand why you might be confused about that given your apparent confusion about the difference between journalism and harassment." Jennifer moved toward the exit again, and this time Tony made a critical error. He reached out and grabbed her arm. The studio erupted in chaos. "Don't touch me," Jennifer said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Do not put your hands on me." Several crew members immediately stepped forward, recognizing that the situation had just escalated to a completely different level. The sound engineer was already reaching for his radio to call security, while the camera operators had instinctively stepped back to avoid becoming part of whatever was about to happen. Tony, apparently realizing the magnitude of his mistake, immediately released her arm, but the damage was done. I wasn't trying to. He stammered. But Jennifer cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. You just put your hands on me to prevent me from leaving a situation where I was being verbally attacked and disrespected. Tony, do you understand what you just did? The security guards arrived at that moment, having been called by the sound engineer. They took one look at the scene. Jennifer standing near the exit with her purse. Tony looking like he'd just seen his career flash before his eyes. And the crew members all looking deeply uncomfortable. And immediately assessed the situation. Ma'am, is everything all right here? The lead security guard asked Jennifer, completely ignoring Tony. No, it's not, Jennifer replied, her voice steady but firm. This interview is over, and I need to leave. This gentleman, she gestured toward Tony without looking at him, seems to be having difficulty understanding that. The security guard nodded and positioned himself between Jennifer and Tony, making it clear that any further interference would not be tolerated. Tony, Jennifer said, addressing him one final time. I want you to think very carefully about what happened here today. I want you to think about the choices you made, the words you used, and the way you treated another human being. Because what happened here wasn't journalism. It wasn't entertainment, and it certainly wasn't professional. She paused at the studio door and turned back one last time. I've been in this business long enough to know that there are journalists who ask tough questions because they want to inform their audience. And then there are people who ask cruel questions because they want to feel powerful. Today, you showed everyone in this room and everyone who will eventually see this footage exactly which category you belong to. With that, Jennifer Lopez walked out of the CBS Sunday Morning studio, leaving behind a crew that was still processing what they had just witnessed and Tony Dokoupil standing alone, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost. The aftermath would be swift and decisive. Within hours, clips of the confrontation would be circulating among industry insiders. By the next day, Tony would be meeting with CBS executives, trying to explain how a routine celebrity interview had turned into a public relations disaster, and Jennifer Lopez would move forward with her career, having once again demonstrated that she would not be diminished by anyone, no matter how big their platform or how small their character. What do you think about journalists who cross the line from tough questioning into personal attacks? Subscribe for more stories about celebrities who refuse to back down.